the impact of tanker rates on the global economy, and Somali piracy making an unwelcome comeback. Hi, it's Marcus Hand, editor of Seatrade Maritime News here, with our April news roundup, Maritime in Minutes, and I'm joined as usual by our correspondent Gary Howard. We'll be discussing the shipping news stories that stood out for us over the last month. With the world of shipping in the global news headlines, things at Seatrade Maritime's News have been pretty busy over the last few weeks, to say the least. So Gary, can you kick us off by taking us back to the first week in April?
Thanks, Marcus. Yep, I'm going to start with my first chirpy assessment of the economic implications of the war in Iran. UNCTAD opened April with a few charts that I'm sorry to say were not an April Fool's joke. Using the 27th of February as a reference, the day before those attacks on Iran, a reference of 100, one of the UNCTAD infographics showed that dirty tanker rates were up to 188 by late March, while clean rates hit 215. These were based off of the Baltic tanker indices. Another chart shows a strong correlation in the past between oil prices and inflation rates in developing and developed economies, and perhaps unsurprisingly, the inflation impact is felt more strongly in those developing economies. From an estimated 4.7% growth in 2025, annual merchandise growth in real terms is set to fall to between 1.5 and 2.5% in 2026, and world GDP rates are also forecast to fall in 2026 to 2.6%, according to these UNCTAD forecasts. To deal with the fallout from the war in Iran, UNCTAD recommends governments, quote, consider a policy mix to stabilise price levels as inflation pressures rise, particularly for vulnerable populations. It also recommends measures to isolate risks, preventing the transmission of systemic risks across energy, trade, and finance. Those sort of warnings always show that you're in a good place, right?
Yeah, I think the world economy is not in the best place ever right now. And I'm going to continue on that theme of the war in Iran and how it's rerouting trade in this case. Saudi's Red Sea ports provide an alternative gateway both for container and tanker shipments. It was the tanker part of that equation that was highlighted by analyst Signal Ocean with the rerouting of crude flows via the Saudi East-West pipeline, which is now running at full capacity. The pipeline feeds into the tanker terminal at Yanbu on the Red Sea and has historically been seen as a release valve for congestion in the Arabian Gulf, but is now a key gateway for VLCC shipments. Monthly VLCC loadings averaged 11 or 12 in January and February. That jumped to nearly 4 times that to 47 in March, as it took over export volumes that would normally move from the Gulf via the Strait of Hormuz. However, the Houthi in Yemen are joining the war in support of Iran, and that potentially puts Yanbu itself and tankers sailing in the southern Red Sea under threat. Shortly after the ceasefire between the US and Iran that started on the 7th of April, the IRGC claimed to have hit the pipeline. However, there did not appear to have been any major disruption caused by that.
Yeah, and if you check out the UNCTAD story as well, that includes some details on how oil flows are being rerouted and the volumes there. I'm going to take us into the second week, though, and I'm actually going to pick out a podcast episode, Marcus, that you released in the second week of April, and that was an interview with Arjun Vikram Singh, currently CEO and MD of Quantum. He was a seafarer in the 1980s and shared his first-hand account of being on board a VLCC when it was attacked during the Iran-Iraq War.
The company had 3 VLCCs that were chartered to the Kuwait Oil Tanker Company, and KOTC did not want their ships going into the Gulf because of the risk. So the Gulf East ships, there were 3 of them. There was the Caribbean Breeze, the Portchester Sky, and the Yucatan Valley, would essentially run up to Mina Al Ahmadi, load cargo over there, and come back down to Khorfakan and transfer to the large KOTC tankers.
There's a retelling of what must have been a pretty terrifying incident, a story which obviously resonates at a time thousands of seafarers remain trapped in the Gulf as potential targets for weapons of war. The limits of naval assets in protecting shipping is also touched on. Arjun does note how the threat to seafarers has evolved in the intervening years, as the concern is now missiles, drones, and small boats rather than bombing. The conversation covers some really interesting ground sort of beyond the attack itself, picking up similarities and differences between life at sea decades ago and in the current day. There's now a greater focus on crew safety in the modern day. Operational considerations were different in the 1980s, I think it's fair to say, and he notes changes in the relationship between captain, crew, and company as well. It's a 25-minute episode and well worth the listen. Find the link in the show notes once you finish listening to Maritime in Minutes.
Thanks for flagging that up, Gary. It was an episode I really enjoyed recording, and something about Arjun, who I've known for many years. I had no idea he'd been through all these experiences. Now, I'm going to come to something quite different. During Singapore Maritime Week, which I'll come back to later, talking to Classification Society executives, one of the major topics was the new building boom. And one yard mentioned specifically in relation to that was Hengli Heavy Industries in China. In early 2023, the moribund former SGX Dalian shipyard was resurrected as Hengli Heavy Industries, in what turned out to be an extremely fortuitous piece of timing, with the shipbuilder enjoying huge success. Now, to kind of illustrate that, just 3 years later, in the first quarter of this year, Hengli secured orders for 108 vessels, and we're not talking dinky little coasters here. The Chinese yard received orders for 76 tankers, comprising 54 VLCCs, 18 Suezmaxes, and 4 LR2s. It also got orders for large container ships and bulkers. Greek shipowners clearly like the yard, Prokopios Dynacom having 43 vessels on order at Hengli, and Marianakis' capital some 30 vessels under construction. If you're enjoying the Seatrade Maritime podcast, make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing on the app of your choice. Switching our usual order a bit here, I'm going to continue into week 3 with a story about Iran's trump card, if you'll pardon the pun, in the war with the US and Israel, and that has been to close the Strait of Hormuz.
United States warship 115. You are entering the area of a military blockade. This blockade of Iranian ports will be enforced and applies to all vessels regardless of flag. Any vessel that further intends to enter or exit an Iranian port will be subject to the right of visit and search in accordance with international law. If you attempt to run the blockade,
blocking an international shipping lane that normally carries 20% of the world's crude oil and gas exports has proved to be one of Iran's most potent weapons. Meanwhile, one country still benefiting from the strait was Iran itself, with sanctioned tankers sailing safely through the waterway and onwards towards primarily Southeast Asia, where shady ship-to-ship transfers are conducted offshore Malaysia, and then for onward shipment to China. So what was the US's answer? Well, essentially to blockade Iran's blockade. From 1400 hours UTC on 13th of April, the US began a blockade of all vessels arriving or departing Iranian ports. Now, Iran has a pretty lengthy coastline, but the US has been able to achieve this by setting up a naval blockade at the edge of the Arabian Sea, stopping vessels entering or leaving the Gulf of Oman. The blockade was later extended to cover Iranian vessels and those under OFAC Iran sanctions anywhere on the world's oceans. As of 29th April, US Central Command said it had redirected 42 vessels attempting to cross the blockade. It's also seized several vessels, and that's something, Gary, I think you're going to be coming back to later.
Yes, who could possibly have foreseen that Iran could affect the Strait of Hormuz during a time of war? For me, though, it's a second chirpy outlook for April, and this time from the IEA, which forecasts the Iran war leading to a 10.1 million barrel per day drop in global oil supply to 97 million barrels per day in March, characterizing the war as the largest disruption in history. 730,000 barrels per day were slashed from its 2026 oil demand forecast in April. In its oil market report, the forecast 1.5 million barrel per day decline in the second quarter of 2026 would be the sharpest oil demand decline since the COVID pandemic, is said. Demand drops as oil prices rise, while the initial drop in the wake of the war Iran has been focused in the Middle East and Asia Pacific. Quote, demand destruction will spread as scarcity and higher prices persist, the IEA warned. The story covers cuts in loadings of crude, natural gas liquids and products through the Strait of Hormuz and the export figures from the Gulf. Cumulative supply losses tallied more than 360 million barrels in March and 440 million barrels projected for April. Quote from the IEA, resuming flows through the Strait of Hormuz remains the single most important variable in easing the pressure on energy supplies, prices, and the global economy. It's worth noting as well that the IEA forecasts were built on the basis of regular oil deliveries resuming in the middle of 2026. So as we enter May, I speculate there is a limited scope for the outlook to improve much, but plenty of room for it to get worse if the strait remains closed for much longer. In the event of prolonged conflict, IEA said energy markets and economies around the world need to brace for significant disruptions in the months to come.
That is not good news when you consider what Trump was saying overnight in terms of it perhaps lasting for months. Right, so moving on to week 4 of the month, and as I said, I was going to come back to Singapore Maritime Week, which started on the 20th of April, and it's the granddaddy of all such weeks, now in its 20th edition. Not surprisingly, the war in Iran and its impact on shipping was a major topic, both on the conference floor at various events, and more informally as well. A major theme within that was the breakdown of long-withstanding global geopolitical and trading orders, with shipping getting caught in the middle. Speaking at a Capital Link event on the Monday, Dr. Gabi Bornheim, president of the German Shipowners Association, said, "We just live in a nightmare of geopolitical crisis. And it's not one crisis, there are so many areas where we have the shipping industry and we see what's going wrong, and it's going wrong between states and politicians." At the week's official opening on Tuesday, senior Singapore government officials warned that the system that allowed 80% of global trade to move freely was under threat. Deputy Prime Minister Gan Kim Yong emphasized the importance of UNCLOS to the global maritime trading system. Today, UNCLOS continues to be the key pillar of the international rules-based maritime order, but what was once a multilateral system underpinned by shared commitment is now increasingly fragile, he said. UNCLOS underpins the freedom of navigation in waterways such as the Strait of Hormuz, and Singapore has made a principled stand on not negotiating with Iran over tolls or transits. As one of the 3 coastal states of the Straits of Singapore and Malacca, which sees over 100,000 vessel transits a year, this principled stand is a very important one to the industry. Now, moving to Wednesday, and in the afternoon, something happened which I'd kind of been fearing. As I was walking into a conference session with some really top ship owners, my phone started buzzing multiple times. There was a container ship under attack in the Strait of Hormuz, and apparently his bridge had been heavily damaged, and I was to end up quickly bashing that out while largely ignoring the conference session I was sat in. And Gary, I'll let you say some more about that.
Yeah, so after a bit of a period of confusion over whether the Strait of Hormuz was open and who was blockading it, there was a flurry of stories on ships being attacked in the week commencing April 20th, as both the US and Iran sent their signals to one another by targeting innocent civilian seafarers on board merchant ships. US forces boarded and seized a couple of laden VLCCs in the Indian Ocean. Both ships were targets of OFAC sanctions for their involvement in transporting Iranian crude oil. Both seizures happened in a similar region and came with a statement from the rebranded US Department of War on how it will continue to deny illicit actors and their vessels freedom of maneuver in the maritime domain. Iran, meanwhile, opened fire on 3 MSC-linked container ships near the Iranian coast within the space of a few hours. Damage was reported on MSC Francesca, and the IRGC Navy said it had seized 2 vessels and escorted them to the Iranian coast. A few days prior to the Iranian attacks, US armed forces fired a 5-inch gun at the engine room of an Iranian-flagged container ship Tuska to disable the vessel before boarding and seizing the ship as part of the US blockade of Iran's ports. As we record today, on April 30th, attacks on ships in the region appear to have calmed down a bit, as it looks to be accepted that the Strait of Hormuz is just closed. Keep an eye on Seatrade Maritime News front page and our dedicated Strait of Hormuz page for the latest developments, though.
There are a few things moving through, and you will actually see we've had the odd story on some of those more sort of transits you are seeing. There was one Japanese VLCC and one container ship that has traded both into and out of the Arabian Gulf. So still some stuff moving there.
Okay, and the last one from me for April. As we record, the latest meeting of the IMO's Marine Environment Protection Committee is underway, discussing a range of issues, but perhaps most notably the Net Zero Framework. The Net Zero Framework's future currently hangs in the balance after a vote on whether to adopt the global emissions regulation was delayed for 12 months during that extraordinary MEPC meeting last October. Nick Savides has been covering goings-on at the IMO, including a piece on Mexico's strong defence of the Net Zero Framework and dismissal of alternative proposals put forward to replace it, arguing that any delay or retreat would constitute a failure of multilateral obligations. The murmurings at IMO suggest that the US influence on the UN body's member states is weakening, with reports of attendees simply failing to attend meetings with US representatives. Nick Saw summed it up with, quote, "The US will definitely not win the day. They're becoming more and more politically isolated on all fronts. It's good to see that the world doesn't really like illegal wars," end quote. This is still very much a live debate, and we won't know the outcomes from MEPC until this episode of Maritime in Minutes is published, but I've had a sneak peek at Nick's next story, which says that if a vote were taken today, one attendee believes the Net Zero Framework would scrape through by, I think, about 5 member states, and that some states strong-armed into supporting the US and Saudi position last time around are supporting the Net Zero Framework again. We'll have a summary of the MEPC meeting once it's all done and dusted, and the meeting is due to end on the 1st of May.
Yeah, it'd be very interesting to see what comes out of that and where we head to when the extraordinary session that is coming up in November. Right, to round out this episode, I'm covering a resurgent security issue for international shipping, and that is Somali piracy. The tanker Honor 25 was hijacked off Somalia on 21st April, and the second vessel, Sword, was hijacked on 26th April. Both vessels are now being monitored by EU NAVFOR naval assets in the region. Additionally, on the 27th of April, the master of a tanker reported being approached by a group of pirate-controlled vessels while transiting the southern Indian Ocean, some 500 nautical miles east of the Somali capital of Mogadishu. With the worsening situation, UK MTO warns vessels to transit the region with caution due to the increased threat of possible pirate action group activity, and the Joint Maritime Information Centre has increased its threat level warning to substantial. On that rather less than upbeat note, that is all that we have time for this episode of Maritime in Minutes. Links to all the stories discussed are in the show notes. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to joining you on the next episode of the Seatrade Maritime News Podcast.